welcome everyone, and welcome for all of those that made it through the black rain into HKU today. Thanks for being here. I very much appreciate it, and everyone else. It's good that you stayed safe, and it's great to see you online. Today, it's my great pleasure to have two colleagues and two friends here. As the last event of this year, we have John Newman, who is at the University of Memphis, and we know each other since, what is that, 2016 or something like that? So 10 years. And then Maria Ioannidou, who is at Queen Mary, London. And we know each other even longer because we have done our PhD together. And it was actually a coincidence that both are here at the same time. And then we thought like, well, let's bring this together rather than having two separate talks, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. In particular, because they are talking about topics that are linked. So John is going to talk about his new paper, his new research, which is about the course of conduct and is very much linked to big tech. And as you already see in the slides here, there is a big octopus, and it is the Apple octopus in this case. And Maria is also going to talk about big tech. She's going to present parts of her new book on big tech in China and in its regulation in China and in Europe. So it's a great pleasure to have all of you here. And the good thing is we're going to have it a bit kind of informal. So we start off with John, like kind of around 30 minutes, and then we thought we can discuss a bit. Then Maria, 30 minutes and a bit of discussion. And we have so many experts here now in the room. Also here, I see, and maybe online, that we will have, I think, a good discussion. So it should be a great event and my highlight of the year. Thank you. Over to you.
Okay. Oh, and I just clicked to advance. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Julian. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here. I think the last time I was in Hong Kong was 2014, so more than a decade ago. Far too long. It's an amazing city. We're privileged enough to see a little bit of the faculty. It's a beautiful building. We are here to talk about big tech. I'm going to finish up by talking a little bit about Apple, but I'm going to talk about some other cases as well. And I want to talk about this binary choice between bringing narrow cases that target isolated acts by a digital monopolist or big cases that target integrated schemes. And I'm going to make the pitch that we should look at the big picture, monopolization by course of conduct, not by isolated acts. So just briefly to roadmap what I'd like to talk through today, I want to talk a little bit about my motivation for taking on this project. Second, I'll make my proposal to you, what I think we should be doing in competition law, and then talk through some analysis underlying this proposal. Why do I think we should look more broadly at conduct by digital monopolists in particular? And then talk through some policy implications, and that'll be it. So first off, motivation. Why talk about isolated acts versus course of conduct? Well, there is, as I'm sure anyone who's been exposed to competition law or antitrust law in the last 5 years knows, a global search for more effective approaches to competition enforcement. There's a broadly held view that our existing approaches, maybe before 2020, roughly speaking, were not up to task. We were doing too little, we were doing it too slowly, we weren't doing enough. And so that has really spawned a global search for different and more effective, stronger, more accurate approaches to competition enforcement. There was a dissatisfaction first, before the excitement about new approaches. I think there was a dissatisfaction with a narrow approach that was, if I can be a little bit critical of my friends in the EU, exemplified, I think, by the EU's Google shopping case. It was, I thought, an innovative, groundbreaking case, and I think a lot of people shared that view. But a lot of people also shared the view that it was too narrowly targeted at one particular type of conduct in one search vertical by a company, Google, that had spread its tentacles, if we want to use the octopus metaphor, all over the web, right? This was one narrowly targeted case that really, in retrospect, didn't do that much to check Google's power. So there was a dissatisfaction first. I think that then led to an enthusiasm. You can see it from my colleagues on this panel. I think anybody in competition who wants to be pro-enforcement and proactive has a new enthusiasm that we really didn't have maybe 10 years ago, the first time Julian and I met. There's an enthusiasm for broader tools and more flexible tools. We see that appear in new laws, often labeled as ex-ante laws or regulations. We see it in the DMA, the UK has their version, Brazil has their version, et cetera, et cetera. And there are also new guidelines. In addition to new laws, there are new guidelines being issued. In the US, for example, there's new merger guidelines that talk a lot more about platform markets, digital markets, network effects, et cetera. So there's a real enthusiasm for these tools. They all rely on the same premise, that the old systems were failing to stop bad conduct. More specifically, and in a kind of a technical sense, the underlying premise was that the error costs from false negatives were too high, that we were missing conduct that was actually harming society at too great a rate. That was causing harm. Even more specifically as to my motivation, I think the existing solutions are still missing another tool. This is a potential complementary solution. It's not a replacement for what's going on around the globe, but it's another complementary solution that I think we should add to our toolkit. So what is the existing set of new rules and new laws? Well, one big proposal that's caught on, I think especially in the EU when we look at the Booking eTraveli case and look at scholarly discourse, is the idea to expand market definition using the idea of an ecosystem market. So how does this work? Well, in most competition cases, you define a relevant market. You don't look at the entire economy. You narrow your lens to just the relevant market, hoping that you'll catch the conduct that exists within that market. But old approaches, some have argued, draw that circle, that relevant market circle, too narrowly, such that it misses bad conduct. So the proposal here is to expand market definition using the idea of an ecosystem market. So maybe rather than one narrow part of a company's business, we look at interconnected parts that broadens the lens enough to catch the bad conduct. So that's one set of changes that have happened. The other big one I talked a little bit about previously is to expand the scope of conduct prohibitions using new ex-ante laws and regulations. So this works a little bit differently. The idea here is that the scope of the law, setting aside the analytical lens, the actual scope of the old law was not broad enough to catch bad conduct. So the proposal here, and what's happened in multiple jurisdictions, is to expand the scope of the law. Then it catches the bad conduct. So these are the existing solutions, at least at a high level. Expand market definition and expand conduct prohibitions. My proposal would be a complement to those. My proposal is this. One enforcement action can and often should target a defendant's entire course of conduct, not just a single type or a single instance of conduct. So what this might look like is, here's the old approach. We bring a narrow case that catches one specific type of conduct. For example, the EU's Google shopping case. But that misses a whole bunch of conduct that occurs outside that narrow lens. And oftentimes that conduct, especially in digital markets where we have network effects, maybe indirect network effects across different sides of a platform, that conduct can actually have self-reinforcing effects. If I do conduct on one side of the market, it can actually increase the harmful effects of conduct on a different side of a platform. And round we can go, such that a narrow case doesn't just miss conduct, but it misses the full effect of the conduct. So my proposal is, let's bring broad cases that catch a full course of conduct and not just a single instance. Okay. You might think, hopefully you think, this sounds like a great idea. Wouldn't everyone agree with this? Well, at least in the US, the answer is no. Unsurprisingly, the industry itself does not like this idea. Big tech companies don't like this idea at all. And scholars, at least some US scholars, more conservative scholars, are skeptical of this. And they somewhat, in a derogatory fashion, liken it to a bad soup. That if you're trying to put too many ingredients into the broth, it makes for a bad tasting soup. So no, everyone doesn't agree with it. I have some people I'd like to convince. Okay, then let me hopefully convince you if you're not convinced already. My analysis. So this type of way of bringing cases, of looking at enforcement actions, can do multiple things. One, it can capture important market realities. And then two, it can justify broader and I think more effective remedies when it's used. I'm going to start with the first one first. So that my proposal to you, my premise, is that looking at a course of conduct instead of one instance can capture important market realities. It can do that in multiple ways. One, I argue that effects from harmful conduct are usually nonlinear. In other words, as you add instances of conduct, the harm doesn't just go up in a straight linear fashion. It actually often goes up in a bumpy or even exponential fashion. So an isolated analysis is going to miss the broader dynamic that's happening. And I have some examples to demonstrate how that could occur. Second, different aspects of harmful conduct can suppress different types or avenues of competition with, again, exponentially harmful results. And I have an example of that as well. And then third, different aspects of conduct, when they're used together, can make a strategy rational for a firm where it would otherwise be irrational and unattractive. So it can make conduct possible and attractive that wouldn't otherwise be. Okay, so starting off with the first one first. Effects are usually nonlinear. And I have some simple diagrams. I'm not an economist. This is as close as I'll get. But let's suppose we have a monopolist, and I've got them up here as Monopco. And let's suppose that they impose a series of exclusive dealing restraints. Okay, so what might that look like? Our Monopco might lock up the first supplier using an exclusive dealing contract or restriction. What does that do to the Monopco's rivals? Well, it cuts off their supply from that supplier. That's leaving one of these rivals, R1, without a supplier. So R1's going to go out of business. We have some harm, right? Okay, now let's suppose our monopolist locks up supplier number 2. We don't see any effect from that, at least in a vacuum. Right? So our level of harm stays flat. But now let's suppose that our monopolist locks up supplier number 3, cutting off supply to R2 and R3. We've now have all the suppliers locked up. There's nobody who can switch away to supplying R2 and R3. So that even when that second contract for supplier 2 in a vacuum or in an isolated way doesn't look harmful, it now leaves rival 2 and rival 3 without any source of supply to switch to. They're going out of business. The harm kicks up again. So if we only looked at number 2, we wouldn't see harm. But if we look at the overall course of conduct, all the restraints together, we can see actually that number 2 was part of the harm. Okay. Second example. In antitrust economics and competition economics, we usually assume that as markets become more concentrated, harm and power increase exponentially, right? We can see this, for example, in the way that competition authorities look at mergers. They often use what's called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, or HHI, to assess markets. And the way that index works is, as a market becomes more concentrated, the antitrust authorities' concerns increase exponentially. Simple diagram here. I argue that the same principle should apply when we're looking at cumulative exclusion. As a course of conduct causes a market to become less and less competitive, it will increase exponentially in the amount of concern it should cause for authorities. Okay, yet another way that effects can be nonlinear. And this one is probably the most like technical one. It stretches my economic ability. I'm the least confident in this one, but here it is. And I would welcome, of course, your questions and pushback on this if it doesn't make sense. So our principle number one here is that a course of conduct can prevent potential entrants who aren't in a market yet, but could enter, from contracting with existing suppliers. What that does then is require a potential entrant to enter multiple markets at the same time, independently. Rather than contracting with suppliers, now our potential entrant must enter the supply market and the downstream market as well. When you have to enter yourself independently, you have a higher risk of failure than when you can contract with an existing supplier. So your risk of failure will increase exponentially the more markets you need to enter independently rather than contracting. Okay, so those are my kind of economic assumptions here. What might that look like? Well, let's say here's our core market, and there are two inputs that you need in order to compete in that market. Now, I put some numbers around this. They're totally made up, but just to illustrate how this could work, suppose it costs $200,000 to enter into core market, and the payout, if you can do it, is $500,000 or $500 million rather. Everyone needs these two inputs to succeed. And let's just suppose that if you can contract with existing suppliers for both of these, your probability of success is high. It's 0.9 for each market. However, if you have to independently enter both markets, your probability of success is lower. And let's just say it's 0.5 for each input market you must enter independently. Okay, my story continues. We can run our math and say, okay, here's our cost of entering the core market. Here's our expected payout from entering the core market. Under scenario one, if there's no exclusionary conduct, the probability of success, 0.9 because I contract with someone here, 0.9 because I contract with someone here, is high. It's 0.81 overall. So I'm willing to spend up to $405 million to enter this core market because the expected payout is $500 million. So I'll enter the market. I'll increase competition. That's great. Okay, here's scenario two. Our incumbent big tech firm blocks the potential entrant from one input only. So I can contract with an existing supplier here, but I must enter that market independently. Here, my probability of success is 0.45, so 0.9 times 0.5. I'm still willing to spend $225 million to enter that core market, so I'll enter it. In scenario three, though, our incumbent blocks the potential entrant from both input markets, so the entrant must independently enter this market, and this market. My probability of success, 0.5 times 0.5, so 0.25, makes it such that I'm only willing to spend up to $125 million. I'm no longer willing to enter that market. I'm no longer able to rationally enter that market. So again, if we just looked at the restraint in the first input market, we might say, oh, there's no harm. If we look, though, at both restraints together, we see now the harm arises, so it's a nonlinear effect from the entire course of conduct. Okay. That was one way in which course of conduct analysis can help us capture important market realities. Here's a second way. Different aspects of conduct can suppress different avenues of competition with about exponentially harmful results. To illustrate this, I wanted to use a restaurant market. I used AI to create this image. I have no idea what the signs actually say. Maybe somebody can help me. I know this part, though. High quality, low prices. So we've got two restaurants in Hong Kong. They compete on two dimensions. Now they serve the same meal, okay? So it's maybe a wonton soup or something. They compete on quality, right? The better wrapper of the wonton, the better broth, and they compete on price. Lower price is better, right? Okay. And let's just say that right now, restaurant A charges $115 for a meal. Restaurant B charges $150 for the same meal. Suppose now that restaurant A and restaurant B agree we are going to stop competing on price. We now charge the same price for this meal, $1.50. But the two can still compete on quality. So one avenue of competition is blocked, the other one is left open. Restaurant A can now compete by offering a higher quality wonton soup for the same fixed price. Consumers have a choice, right? So there's some competition still. That's good for consumers. I can go to the lower price or I can go to the higher quality. In fact, it's possible that A's quality adjusted price, because it's a higher quality, is actually effectively $1.15 again. I think an economist would agree that's at least possible. So if we've only restrained one aspect or avenue of competition, the market might still work as well as it did before. Okay, now let's suppose instead restaurant A and restaurant B agree we will stop competing on price and stop competing on quality. We're the same restaurant now, we're charging the same price for the same meal. The quality adjusted price is the same. Consumers now have lost any meaningful choice. It's much worse when two avenues of competition are blocked than when only one avenue of competition is blocked. It's an exponential effect. Okay, now the third way that course of conduct analysis I think can help us capture these important market realities is that different aspects of conduct, so different types of restraints or exclusionary conduct, when they're used together, can make a strategy attractive that would otherwise be irrational. Okay, again, not an economist, but I do have some numbers here to hopefully illustrate this dynamic. Let's suppose we have, again, a monopolist in the middle of our distribution system here. They have a rival. There are some input suppliers. They charge different prices. And then we have our consumers down at the bottom. And let's suppose our monopolist wants to use something called predatory pricing to try to drive out its rival and capture this market totally. Well, Monopco, we know, has input costs of $100 per unit. We know that the rival's input costs in this world are $100 per unit. So if our Monopco sets any price lower than 100, it will lose money. For instance, if our monopolist tries to set prices as $90, it will lose money on each sale. That makes this strategy a little less attractive. So let's suppose instead our monopoly just sets the price at 200. Now we make a profit. Rivals may follow. We end up in a world where the price is 200. So that's predatory pricing. It's often unattractive for a company because in order to do it, they must lose money on each sale they make. It's not always irrational, but that is a constraint on monopolists' ability to engage in predatory pricing. Now let's suppose, though, that our monopolist can do two things at once, two different types of conduct: predatory pricing and raising rivals' costs. So let's say that our monopolist enters an exclusive dealing contract with this supplier, the best supplier, the low price supplier. That locks out our rival and raises our rival's costs. Now they have to deal with the next best, the second best supplier who charges a higher price. The rival must charge $200 just to break even. Our monopolist can now charge a price of $150, still making a profit because its input cost is low. The rival cannot compete. This is effectively a predatory pricing scheme, and now it's rational because our rival cannot match even an above cost price for our monopolist. So the two aspects of conduct work together to make this overall strategy rational where it might not otherwise be. Okay, so, and then of course we're left with our monopolist. At the end of the day, now they'll raise prices. That's bad for consumers, etc. So that's a set of ways in which a broader lens, looking at a full course of conduct, can capture important market realities. I think it can also justify broader, more effective remedies. And that, I think, is a much more intuitive point. When you broaden the lens to look at more conduct, usually you get a stronger remedy from the enforcer or the court that can do a better job. Okay, then with my maybe 7 minutes or so, a few of the implications here. I think different rules should apply when you're looking at a course of conduct than when you're looking at an isolated incident. For one thing, agencies and courts should I think, aggregate instances of the same type of conduct. So exclusive dealing number 1, exclusive dealing number 2, exclusive dealing number 3, all those should be looked at together in order to, if we need to, exceed the minimum thresholds for liability. For instance, some US courts require exclusive dealing to cover 30% of a market. We should be able to aggregate all the exclusive dealing to clear that hurdle as needed. I have an example here, just illustrative. I also think agencies and courts should aggregate instances of different types of conduct in order to exceed minimum thresholds for liability. For example, some US courts require conduct that is reasonably capable of contributing significantly to monopoly power. So there's a threshold of harm that an enforcer must exceed. And then third, agencies and courts, I think, should apply general standards rather than hard to satisfy categorical rules when you're looking at a course of conduct. So using, again, my US example, some US courts require costs, or prices rather, to be below costs for predatory pricing. I argue that when you're looking at a full course of conduct, that rule doesn't apply anymore. And we actually saw an example where it wouldn't make sense. And then shifting to remedies, again, I think more intuitively, even course of conduct cases should yield more powerful remedies. That's for multiple reasons. One, course of conduct has a greater probability of causing harm, so we should be more confident that harm occurred in a course of conduct case. Two, course of conduct has a greater probability of causing greater harm than an isolated incident, so the harm will generally be higher in a course of conduct case. That should yield a more powerful remedy. And then finally, a course of conduct indicates that our defendant is capable of using different means of causing harm, so we should have a broader remedy to deal with those different means that our defendant has already used to cause harm. Okay, so then, with my last few minutes, I want to now turn from theory, that was all theory, things I thought about on the long flight over from the US, to look at actual cases, to look at things that enforcers are doing in the real world, and ask, how are we doing? Are we moving from an isolated, narrow method of enforcement to a broader course of conduct type lens? And I think the answer is yes. So if we start over on the narrow end of this funnel with the Google shopping case, I think everybody would agree that was a very narrow case. It was followed by a case that I actually worked on while I was deputy director of the US Federal Trade Commission. The FTC tried to break up Meta's purchases of Instagram and WhatsApp, and also included some other conducts as well. That case didn't go well at trial, but it was at least an attempt to broaden the lens to include multiple things. It was followed by a case against Google, often known as US v. Google Search. That case was broader than the EU's Google shopping decision, and it has yielded some broader remedies. There's an even broader case, I would argue, against Google's advertising technology side of its business. The US v. Google ad tech case, there's a similar EU case. I'm going to talk a little bit about this one. The FTC v. Amazon case, I think, is broader still. And really, and this was one I worked on also while I was at the Federal Trade Commission. And I suppose I should say these are my views only, not the FTC. But this case, I think, really leaned into a course of conduct way of thinking and looking at the world. And then the US v. Apple case, I think, is even broader. It's like a real ecosystem type theory of harm. So I do think enforcers are getting better and better at using this lens, even if courts have been a little too slow to keep up. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about a particular case, the FTC v. Amazon case. This case uses multiple of the aspects that I talked about earlier. So one part of the case alleges that different parts of Amazon's conduct work together to have a exponentially greater harm than if either part alone had been used. So at least in the US, Amazon's core business has two aspects. One is called Amazon Retail. Here, Amazon acts as a traditional retailer. It buys products from manufacturers and then sells them to consumers. And then Amazon also operates a marketplace where it just has a platform that brings together third-party sellers with consumers. So there, Amazon does not purchase the goods itself. It just brings together and matches shoppers and sellers. In our complaint, we alleged Amazon uses, and if you'll forgive my like comic book, graphic novel approach here. Amazon uses its retail arm, that's how we described it, to suppress some price competition. But then Amazon also used its marketplace arm in a different way to suppress price competition. And together, the two had a much bigger effect than either one would on its own. This is kind of like the Hong Kong restaurants example, right? We also argued that Amazon's course of conduct, overall course of conduct, there were multiple examples in our complaint, not just the ones I described a moment ago. We argue that Amazon's course of conduct blocked multiple aspects of competition, including every important aspect of competition. So Amazon took steps to stop price competition. It took steps to stop sellers from competing on variety and selection. It took steps to stop rivals from competing on quality. And then finally, it specifically targeted innovative startups and either killed or acquired them, stopping innovation competition. Together, the effect was much greater than any one of those in isolation. So then just to briefly recap and summarize, one, my proposal is that competition enforcement should consider defendants' entire course of conduct, not just isolated incidents. I argue using kind of theory, economic theory, and casework that conduct can have exponential and reinforcing effects, particularly in digital markets where network effects can accelerate all of this. And then finally, authorities have started to do this, but courts have been somewhat slow to follow. There are still, though, some exciting cases, I think, working their way through the system. So it's still in development. With that, thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, John. Fascinating presentation. I have a lot of questions on my list, but I want to open the floor first. And I can maybe even also open the Q&A online. You can just like type them in and we can address them. Questions, comments, or should I get started? Or Maria, do you want to get started? This one, and I'll get it.
No, I'm happy to get started. It's fascinating, and you put it in a very structured manner, starting from the motivation, the claims, and the broader implications. And I very much like the link with the case law against big tech and digital markets. I have a kind of a very narrow question listening to you presenting the point on exclusive dealing. I was wondering, and perhaps maybe in the youth, that's the approach we're already taking. I was wondering how this broader contact approach is different than the current approach with respect to exclusive dealing. That's a sort of my narrow question, just to start off. And the more broader question, and that comes from my own sort of personal interest on the topic, the question on remedies. So just sort of a disclaimer, I'm very much agree with you that we should take a broader conduct approach. But from an enforcement perspective, and having worked also at the Greek Competition Commission myself, these are really difficult cases. And unless you can convince the courts, I'm very much pro enforcers trying to bring those cases. And I like the fact that you started sort of in the narrow way, but you were not critical of the EU Commission in bringing the Google Shopping case because it sort of set the bar and then everything else followed from there. But yeah, I guess my point is these are difficult cases. What are the chances of success going forward? And then there's the elephant in the room. And even if we are successful, and I'm thinking here the US Google case, where does that leave us when it comes to remedies, which for me is the much more difficult question within the difficult area that we're already discussing, sort of bringing a case on a broader approach to monopolization or abuse of dominance.
Well, thank you. These are...
Like this?
Oh, yeah, I think good.
Good.
Unsurprisingly, wonderful questions. As to the first one, when we're dealing with exclusive dealing, how is this different from the current approach? I'm not sure it is that different if we stick with only exclusive dealing. I use that as a, I think, easy, intuitive, approachable example, hoping to lure the reader in. And then once I have you, I can spring some of the more complex, maybe more controversial arguments like the predatory pricing one. But I think your intuition is exactly right, that we're fairly familiar with companies engaging in a series of exclusive dealings, even ones that take a variety of forms. I think back to the Microsoft case in the late 1990s in the US, and then there's a EU sort of equivalent. It was very much like the Google search case, right? Where you had Microsoft locking up all the different mechanisms of distributing internet browsers. At the time, they were still physical disks. I don't know, you remember, we're all old enough. I won't out Maria. Julian's old enough. So yeah, I don't think there's that much new there. I do hope to use that example, though, as a kind of an attractive, like, starting point for this. And then on remedies, I think it's exactly right. Courts are skeptical. The earliest returns in the US are on the Google search case. And I think, like Google shopping in the EU, it's a mixed success. I mean, there is some good there. I always stick up for the EU for bringing the Google shopping case, because I remember what a big deal it was in the US to see somebody doing a case like that after our FTC had already failed to do anything. And it did do something. It yielded some remedy. It was, slower than we'd like. I think of the US v. Google search case, which is our first case, looking at a course of conduct in a long time, as kind of a mixed success when it comes to remedy. The remedy was broader than some might have thought. It does require disclosure of the search index. It requires some syndication of search queries, et cetera. So it went beyond just terminating the exclusive dealings, which is good. And I think that broader remedy came from the DOJ's course of conduct approach. It came from a broadened approach in the beginning, in the first complaint. It was also, though, narrower than we would like. It doesn't even terminate all the payments for defaults, et cetera. So it, I would say, is kind of a mixed bag, but it, to me, is encouraging. If the first case we brought in the US is at least somewhat successful, that's good, because the EU went on to do much more than the Google shopping case. I hope we do as well in the US. I do think, though, you've been at an agency, I've been at an agency. I suspect both of us, when we hear about a big case, start thinking about the costs and the people it requires and the time it requires. And that is, to me, I think actually the hardest challenge for this approach is just the resources it requires. That's something I'll need to deal with in the paper.
Great, excellent. I'm going to follow up with the question, and then I'll open the floor again. But I was also thinking, I X'd out my question, which was exactly the same question, which was about exclusive dealing. But then I was thinking, maybe it makes sense to structure your paper because what you're saying is maybe the whole thing that you're proposing is not as radical as it might sound, because we are already doing some elements of it. So we can maybe expand it. So you can basically provide the example of exclusive dealing as an example where we already do things like that, and then move on from there. And with that in mind, I was wondering, the paper is focused on monopolization. For the EU lawyers, there would be 102 cases, abuse of dominance. But I think you can even draw in Section 1 of the Sherman Act cases. So I don't know how they work in the US, but I suppose it works in exactly the same way. So I'm thinking about very classical cartel cases in the EU, where you have the concept of continuous and single and continuous infringement. So where you have one overall cartel that maybe starts one meeting at a time, but over the years, it develops. And you do not only have like, a price agreement in 1987, but then you have another meeting where you have like a market sharing and some other things, and then like again another price agreement. And we look at this, at least in the EU, as a single overall infringement, and sometimes the lawyers are a bit annoyed by this because they think like, oh, you're putting this all into a basket and you haven't proven it on this point and so on. And when I have these discussions with people, I say like, well, you should be happy that the competition agency is not bringing this as 12 individual cases, because you would be paying 12 times the fine and not only once. But I think maybe there's something to be said there. To what extent this is, you can also draw in from the Section 1 cases.
Maybe starting with that second point first. I love that. Yeah, we have the similar laws on the books in the US. In fact, some of the most friendly case law that I will probably use is from agreements rather than monopolization or abuse of a dominant position. And that kind of segues into a response to your first question, that I do think this paper is somewhat descriptive, especially when I start talking about the casework. So really the, I guess, underlying motivation arises from my experience working on, in particular, the Amazon case in the US, and just feeling like there wasn't that much even theoretical economic literature on this, which is shocking to me, because as you said, it's not that new of an idea. I think enforcers, Maria, I'm sure you would agree, enforcers like to think this way. They like to look at a full market. They like to look at all the conduct. They don't like to artificially ignore things. And so I do think enforcers are somewhat in the habit of doing this, even if the case is sometimes small. That's probably more because of resources or litigation risk than theoretical objections. I do think there's a gap, at least as far as I can tell, in the theoretical economic literature, and then downstream of that, the empirical economic literature on this point. So in some ways, although I'm not an economist, and you saw how clumsy my attempts can be, it's kind of a theoretical economic paper in a way.
Great. Yes. Thanks, Maria. You wanted to have another point?
Yeah, just listening to you speaking on this, and since you brought up the single and continuous infringement, and I agree. I agree that we lack a sort of theoretical paper bringing all the arguments together, and that's a great contribution. I'm thinking now from a practical point of view, because you brought in the enforcement points, so how the enforcers would think about it, and also how the parties, so the business under investigation, how they would attack such a case. And I was thinking, since Julian brought up the single and continuous infringement point, the criticism against this type of cases, at least from my experience, is that you don't have enough evidence to span all the period. So what you're trying to do is you find some sort of circumstantial evidence here and there just to sort of expand the period and come up with a higher fine. So that's one point. The second point, from a pragmatic perspective, I agree that we can bring a broader approach to sort of different types of conduct, and especially in digital markets where you have this sort of ecosystemic approach. But from an evidence-based perspective, how is it different? So I'm thinking as an EU competition lawyer here, that we often say when we're teaching students on exploitative abuses, on that concept, that at least in the earlier case law, what we see is that the European Commission and national competition authorities were reluctant to bring exploitative cases because these are difficult cases to sell to the public and sort of to have the evidential base to prove it. They don't want to act as price regulation. So they bundled that with some other type of exclusionary conduct. How is this broader conduct approach different than having different types of monopolization cases bundled together or different abuse of dominance theories bundled together? And so you start with the evidence and see where it takes you, and you have the parties arguing that, well, you don't have a solid theory on A, you're just trying B and C and D.
That's a great reminder of some of the things I heard when I was at the agency. So I think my hope is if we can put a solid theoretical framework around this, and at least in the US, stop talking about bad soup, which is really the way we talk about this, and start talking about something that has real teeth, that has a really solid framework, has solid assumptions underlying it, that our response to the objection, which is, oh, you don't have enough evidence, would be, well, we don't need as much evidence in a case like this. When we look at a concentrated market, we don't fight with the defendants about, oh, maybe it's actually really competitive in this market. It's just, hey, it's a concentrated market. You have market power. It's just, that's not even a debate, right? It's not even a fight, really. That's really an assumption, though, right? In some ways. Sometimes we have some direct evidence, but there's an almost bedrock assumption that as a market gets more concentrated, it performs worse. I would like that same assumption to apply here, or a similar assumption to say, we don't need as much evidence because the theory tells us when this is happening, the harm, the probability of harm, and the size of harm is likely greater. So even if I have less evidence, that doesn't mean we don't have a good case here. So I think that really is the overarching goal here, is to have almost a presumption, or at least an assumption, in the law.
Excellent. Thank you. There's an email, a message, a question from Liang, and John, you can see it here, and maybe you can summarize in your own ways. And I can say something about the EU context. And actually, Maria might be actually also good placed how you would deal with that in a practical context as an agency.
Yeah. So the question is really nicely constructed because it illustrates its own question. It's a series of questions, right? It's the three different questions, but they are also kind of one overarching question. So our question for us then is, do we want to deal with them in an isolated way or in an overarching way? I think we can take them in turn, but I think you're right, Maria in particular, you may be well situated to tackle the second part of this. So the first question is, and it's kind of the big one, how do we distinguish between a single infringement that's ongoing over time and several separate and independent violations? I think there you've got to look at a combination of the facts at hand and economic theory. And sometimes it really is heavy on the economic theory. But when we were looking at the Amazon case, for instance, we saw instances of conduct that had to do with stopping price competition facing consumers. And then we had instances of conduct that had to do with stopping sellers from offering products on other platforms. And so we had to look at what the Amazon executives themselves were saying about those two seemingly different, seemingly separate and independent violations. And Amazon's executives understood very well that these two were actually connected. So you kind of, I think, just follow the facts is the way to answer that one. And then the proportionality principle, I think in some ways that kind of gets back to our previous discussion to say, look, even if the evidence is lower here, and even if the defendant may be surprised if an enforcer brings a case like this, if I'm right, then the harm is greater and maybe much greater than in a normal case. So that, I think, has to affect our proportionality analysis.
Yes, thank you. Maria, do you want to go, or I can just like give an example of a continuous case, single and continuous infringement that I was involved when I was at the European Commission. So we had a case, a cartel case, and that was going on for, in the end, the Commission found 10 years. And they said, look, it started off with a parties meeting. All the parties have met on this and that day, and we have evidence that they were talking about price on that day. And then half a year later, we had another meeting. They also talked about price. 1 year later, we have also evidence that they met again, but they also talked about markets in that case. And another year, we also had the same people, but there were some people that dropped out. They were not there in that meeting, but they were there in a meeting in the year after that, and they talked about price. They did not talk about the markets again, but they talked about price. But in the meeting afterwards, they again talked about markets. So that would be kind of the fact pattern that we saw. And some of the defendant lawyers, they said, well, you haven't proven that defendant X has not been there in one of the meetings, so there is no evidence that the case continued. And I said to my colleagues, it's like, so are they really saying that they were part of a price cartel in 1981? They didn't follow through with the market agreement and the price cartel in 82, but they were again part of an agreement in 83. And then we should fine them 10% for the 81, plus 10% for the 83, and then maybe add a multiplier because they have already infringed the cartel prohibition in 81. That I don't think that they want to argue that. But Maria.
It's a fascinating paper. I'm looking forward to read it, honestly. It sparked a lot of thinking, and I want to make a distinction here, because we brought in the single and continuous infringement point, and what you have been describing is with relation to cartels. So for me, cartels are different from monopolization conduct. On what point? The point is how to get the evidence, but once you get the evidence, the anti-competitive conduct is there. So that's different than having a difficult monopolization case where on top of the evidence, you need to also argue anti-competitive effects, and you have different views there. So going back to something that John was saying, so I agree 100% that you need to get the facts, you need to get the economic theory, you need the evidence, and you follow the facts. For monopolization cases, you need to add another factor in, and that is framing. How you frame the facts that you have to fit a theory of harm. And the simple example for me here is Google Shopping. So Google Shopping, and we will discuss a bit this case in the second part. So this is a case that started in 2010 by the European Commission. The decision came out in 2017. Before the decision came out, there was a lot of academic writing, what the theory of harm would be based on the facts. So the facts very quickly, you have Google, you have a platform sort of favoring its own service, Google Shopping in that case. And now we know that the theory of harm here, we call it self-preferencing. So you favor your own service at the expense of rivals. But at the time, this theory of harm, articulated in such a way, was not out there. Economic theory behind it was there, it's leveraging. And from the Commission's point of view was that we follow established principles, we follow the case law. From the academic point of view, I don't know if you remember, even though we were very young at the time, the theory of harm, and we are still young, so the theory of harm there was, is it a refusal to supply case? Is this an essential facility case? How is the Commission going to frame it? Because it didn't fit the case law in such a manner. So I think in this type of cases, it's more challenging the framing point of view as well, rather than the evidence when it comes to singular continuous infringement. These are difficult in terms of getting the evidence right, but once you have them, you just, okay, I'm not saying these are easy cases, but if I have evidence that they met in 2010 and then I have evidence that they met in 2013, as a competition authority, this is a covered conduct. I should not be expected to have evidence for every single meeting. I think that should be enough. But for me, it's more difficult, the framing point. And we did have cases at the Commission that we got challenged a lot, that what you're trying to do here is to fit it in the more of an object box abuse type, whereas you don't have enough evidence to show that you have effects because of the coverage of the market, and so on and so forth. But so that's some thoughts listening to you speaking, guys.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful. And in the vein of reminding myself that this is not totally new, what it brings to mind is actually the old Microsoft case in the US that alleged something like 16 different types of conducts. And some of them were familiar and fit into a familiar category, but some of them were not. They were like the self-preferencing. There was no name for it. There was no label for it. But I think that DOJ was very smart to not try to fit it into an existing label. They just said, here's what Microsoft is doing. It's not building a better product. It's making things worse. It's making rivals have a harder time to compete. That's it. That's all we need to prove. And that's, if you read our Amazon complaint, we debated, should we call it an octopus or a castle or a moat? And we went back and forth and back and forth. And eventually we said, no, let's just tell the story. Just let the facts speak for themselves. And I think that's the best way to frame these cases.
Great. Thank you, John. Questions? More? I have another one. Because we still have 5 minutes, so I'm going to take them. So I actually have 3. Let's see whether I can pack them somehow together.
You want to leave some room for me, or shall I keep it?
No. Then I'll do 2. So I'm thinking about this a bit more broadly. And I think in a certain way you already mentioned it, but how are you going to take this forward? What are, in terms of burden of proof, if you're trying to say, look, there's a course of conduct, how many legs does the course of conduct need to have? So that's essentially the same if you compare it to the single and continuous thing. What is it enough that I approve 1981 and 1983, or do I also need to have an 82 for the whole thing to make sense? And what happens if the defendant is able to kick out one? Does it still stand on two legs, or is one leg enough, or how does that go? And related to that, you mentioned the predatory pricing. Maybe there is a role now suddenly, and I don't think that's what you do in the US context, at least at the moment, for intent. So you had the example that, look, they cut the price, but they also did the exclusionary agreement, and it only made sense if you brought these two together. And maybe then, and you also mentioned the facts that you had from the leadership in, what was it, Apple or Google. They knew exactly what they were doing and how these two were together. So maybe there is some role for intent.
Yes, I think that's a great suggestion. Okay, so the first one first. Yeah, and this kind of relates back to, I think, Leon's question as well. How many instances of conduct create a course of conduct? Now that I'm a professor instead of an enforcer, I can say, well, it depends, Julian. It depends on the facts, of course. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take the Amazon case, for example. We spent a lot of time looking at what the companies themselves were saying about the most important avenues of competition in that market. What do the companies think are the most important attributes for consumers? And it was really price and selection, right? So what Amazon sets out to do is to be the lowest price and the biggest selection. If anybody's familiar with the Amazon logo, there's a little arrow that connects the A and the Z, right? That's because they want to sell everything from A to Z. True story. Yeah, should I put it back up there? Oh, I don't know if I can go backwards. Yeah, the A connects to the Z.
Never thought about that.
So it's price and selection are the most important. Good. At least one thing. And so I would say, as long as you have conduct that affects price and selection, then two could be enough to have a course of conduct. It would, though, depend on the facts. And then second, as to intent, yes, absolutely. I think intent evidence, at least in the US, got just absolutely criticized, derided. Academics said it was worthless, don't rely on it. I think that's absolutely incorrect. Anybody who's been at an enforcement agency would say, we need to know intent evidence. It's extremely helpful. I think we just need to distinguish intent and motive. Like, motive is just about like state of mind. Are you saying mean, evil things? But intent evidence of why are you doing what you're doing, I think very, very useful.
Great. Excellent. We are just perfectly on time. If there are no questions, but I wouldn't want to cut off anyone, then we go over to Maria. Do you also want to, or do you want to sit? Do you have slides? You have the slides. Good. Yes. Yes, exactly.
Okay. I should thank also everyone that has managed to come in such a difficult day, and Julian for the kind invitation. It's always a pleasure to be in such great company. And like John, it's been 10 years since my last visit in Hong Kong, so it's great to be here, and thank you very much. So My 30-minute sort of presentation today will build on the research which fed into the book we co-authored with Bingwan Xiong. So it's sort of a common presentation, even though he wasn't able to make it today. And I will start by something that John mentioned in his presentation. And this is something that we have been discussing also with Julian and John in a conference we were recently in Seoul. So there's this global surge, you said, for more effective approaches to competition enforcement. And this was sort of the driver for this book. So how do I... this clip. No? The left. Okay, great. So this is the book, which started as a sort of an idea at conference discussion back in 2018. So the sort of motivation behind this project was that enforcers around the globe, they're dealing with common problems when it comes in general, but also when it comes to digital markets. There was a big discussion at the moment, what makes digital markets differently, a sort of a wave of policy report that have then fed into actual cases, but there is also this sort of agreement that we cannot quite nail it in competition law enforcement. So the underlying motivation behind this project was, okay, let's compare what is the EU doing vis-a-vis China, whereas the digital markets, they have the common economic drivers, but different digital giants. So what are the commonalities, what are the differences, what can we learn from each other? And so I'm not going to bore you too much with underlying anatomy of digital markets. John has touched upon some of these issues. So we see multi-site platforms and network effects, which sort of complicate competition law enforcement, starting even at the level of market definition. And some of the issues have now been dealt with, at least from an EU perspective in the new definition, market definition notice, but applying that in practice makes it increasingly difficult because once you have network effects, the analysis can go both ways. And this is in fact what we see in different cases. What we also see in the digital sphere is how should we deal with data, and we have changed. There was an economist, I believe, a very famous economist cover back in 2017 that sort of made this analogy that data is the new oil. So this is what drives the underlying driver of sort of immense economic profits in this market. The point on whoever is there first, the winner takes it all dynamics. And once the market has tipped, it's very difficult to challenge that. And then from an enforcement perspective, the enforcer's toolbox is how do we challenge, how do we deal even with markets where our economic tools are very much focused on price? So how is it that we run the assessment in markets that price is not there? And there's a whole of different theories about, primarily I'm thinking here, Tim Wu on the attention economy. I'm going to learn this by the end, hopefully. Okay, here we are. So this is another point that came up in our discussion before, the problem we have assessing ecosystems. And is indeed true that now we see emerging case law, not to the extent that some of us would have liked. But again, I think being an academic gives you all sort of the power to think and speak independently. But once you sit in an agency and you need to build the case, you see how difficult it is to bring new cases. And there is a lot of value in trying to do that. But I don't think we are there yet. There is booking and travel in the EU that have sort of touched upon ecosystem in more detail than other cases. And this is one of the very few mergers that has been blocked. But yeah, there's also this from platform to ecosystems. And it seems that as technology develops, our analytical tools become more outdated faster. So once we have the platforms, now we have ecosystem, and it's becoming exponentially more difficult to address the problems. Okay. So challenges for competition law enforcement, and this is sort of, we try to sketch it out in chapter 3 in the book. So a very popular discussion that has been there in competition law And this was around when we were doing our master's with Julian and our PhD, not that long ago, but longer than. So there's this whole idea, what are the objectives of competition law, and are we sort of there to increase consumer welfare, whatever that means, because then there's a different perspective. If you look at US school, the Chicago school in the US, consumer welfare, the way we approach it under EU competition law. But beyond the economic objectives, there's a big discussion about different objectives that have permeated competition law analysis. So from more, if you like, economic to the more political objectives, and there is a resurgence of fairness considerations under EU competition law enforcement. And this is not only a policy perspective per se, it is also reflected in the cases that competition authorities choose to bring. So linked to that and linked to the realities we face in digital markets, we see a higher number of cases that try to build exploitative theories of harm on unfair terms and conditions. And for me, there's an interesting analogy here because some of those cases, they have been brought as competition law cases, whereas other competition agencies that have also consumer enforcement powers, they brought it under their consumer arm. And there's something to be said there. So this points to the limits of the traditional consumer welfare standards, the resurgence of fairness. And in the book, we argue in favor of an integrative approach. So sort of this is not new, there's a wider academic literature there, but it's interesting to see that this resonates not only in the EU, but also in some of the cases that Bing Won has discussed with respect to China. And what is interesting also from an enforcer's perspective is how you approach the cases. So how rigid and how formal the enforcement is. And in China, they often make use of this dual track approach. So alongside hard enforcement with high billion-dollar fines, and there were a couple of cases that they strike me as being sort of the outliers in terms of how fast the competition authorities have managed to conclude those cases. I'm thinking here the Alibaba case. And one of your colleagues here, I believe is at the Chinese University in Hong Kong, Sandra Marco Collin, who has written about this case, the Alibaba case. This was concluded in record time, in less than 3 months. And this has never happened in Europe. But this is coupled with soft intervention. So they often make use of a tool that they have of administrative interviews where they summon the executives and they're trying to resolve it amicably. So there's this sort of combination of hard with soft enforcement that may sometimes yield the record results. So I will focus more on monopolization of abuse of dominance. What we cover also in the book is every tool across the competition law enforcement spectrum. So we discuss anti-competitive agreements in the EU and China. We cover abuse of dominance, monopolization, as well as merger control. And this is another project for the future, the sort of resurgence of a large number of regulation in this sphere. So when it comes to anti-competitive agreements, one of the things that we have discussed, and this goes to a sort of categorization that Ariel Ezrahi and Maurice Tukey have sketched out excellently in their book, Virtual Competition. So when you have algorithmic tools, how does that change the analysis when it comes to anti-competitive agreements, in particular cartel agreements? So they have 3 scenarios where you have sort of the algorithms, the tools, sort of reinforcing existing human communication. These are the easy cases. Then you have cases where you have sort of the algorithm acting as a hub. And I'm thinking here, Julian has also written about that with respect to the Uber platform, where they're having a sort of common software. And then you have the hubs, everyone using the same algorithm. How does that change competition analysis? And the harder cases where you have algorithms colluding, we are not quite there yet, at least we don't have evidence. There isn't any single case ever been brought by competition agencies on autonomous collusion. But there are evidence that suggests that this may be possible. There have been many press discussions, especially by the previous EU commissioner in Europe, that has urged regulation by design. So again, this brings us in a sphere where we see the limits of competition law enforcement. And perhaps this is also a point that we also bear in mind, that we tend as competition lawyer to think of competition law as an all-encompassing sort of set of super tools. And to some extent, it has a lot of potential, and that's the beauty of it because it's very flexible, but there's so much you can do. So alongside competition law enforcement in this sphere, we have a large number of regulations, not only in EU, in China as well, and this is something that we also address in the book. Okay. What is interesting is that when it comes to vertical agreements, there is a lot of case law in Europe, not so much at the Commission level. This was at the remit of national competition authorities. But also my own experience suggests that a large number of cases at national competition authorities in various different member states is on vertical agreements. And there's a paradox here because we see that enforcement when it comes to anti-competitive agreements in China remains rather rare. And this phenomenon, we explain it in the book, based on the soft enforcement dual track strategy that I just sketched out. Interestingly here, if you're looking at it from a comparative enforcement perspective, China has looked a lot upon the EU to see how you deal with vertical agreements. So the 2022 AML modernization, there were key updates sort of codifying safe harbors along the lines of the approach we follow in Europe with respect to the vertical block exemption regulation. So they sort of blacklisted RPM, and they explicitly prevented, outlawed hub and spoke platform conspiracies. So this is sort of reflected a similar approach as we see with the guidelines on vertical agreements in the EU. And we also see sort of a pragmatic approach to enforcement when it comes to anti-competitive agreements. So they have these practices, and this is a prevailing practice with respect to exclusivity clauses in China. They have this forced either or exclusivity approach, where we see that this would fall from an enforcement perspective more under abuse of dominance arm rather than anti-competitive agreements assessment. And this brings me to dealing with market power in digital markets. And just to give you a bit of context here, some of the issues we have already discussed them. What we see with respect to competition law enforcement here is that we have novel theories of harm, and we have touched upon self-preferencing, and theories of harm that, in essence, the economics behind them are not that novel. And I'm thinking here of the Google Android case in the EU, which the underlying theory of harm is tying. Okay, this is an easy sort of case to bring based on an established theory of harm, but link it to the remedies point. The remedy, we can debate how successful it can be. So even though we see quite a lot of case law in this sphere up until now, and I'm going to touch upon it, what we see is that in terms of finding a solution to the competition law problem we identify, we haven't been that successful. And part of the criticism here is related to the speed of enforcement. So the European Commission has been criticized for not intervening quickly enough. And part of the proliferation of policy initiatives and regulation in this sphere has played a lot on the point of we need to intervene quicker. But this doesn't hold true for every case. We have quite a few cases that the European Commission has managed to conclude cases in less than 3 years, and national competition authorities, I'm thinking here the German Competition Authority, when it comes to its own one of its own cases against Amazon, they managed to conclude it in less than a year. So sometimes the point of competition law enforcement not being quick enough is not really fair. It is, okay, of course, you need a lot of time to build a case, the more so as you sort of widening the funnel. But sometimes, depending on the case, some cases are resolved quicker than others. There's the point of how do you structure the remedy here? How do you monitor the remedy? And how do you devise a remedy that can make a difference when the market has tipped? How do you reverse market tipping? How do you restore competitive harm? And I'm posing questions, and these are questions that I'm trying to address in my current research, and these are really, really, really difficult questions. And these are difficult questions for many reasons. One is the obvious reasons that you have to sort of take into account too many considerations. So from an economic perspective, from the perspective of the structure of those markets, from the perspective of the quick evolution of the technology, but there are restraints from a legal perspective as well, especially under EU law. So even if you're a competition authority and you think that you have come up with a remedy that can address the problem, there are important limits imposed upon you by EU law when it comes to remedies, and there is strict case law on how proactive you can be in your remedial design. So this is where you bring in additional legislation. And here I'm thinking the Digital Markets Act in the EU, where you're trying to speed things up and sort of get the parties more involved in a sort of a soft compliance. But again, what we see in the years that the DMA has been enforced, and it's been 3 years now, is that it's not as quick as one would have expected it to be. And as we will see, some of the issues that have emerged in competition law cases, they're still debated under the DMA as well. So this is a sort of a very quick enforcement record of the European Commission when it comes to cases against big platforms, again, under Article 102 or 82 as it was at the time. You see two different types of proceedings. So I touched upon the soft intervention under Chinese competition law. Under EU competition law, we have what we call the commitments process under Article 9. So this is a sort of a negotiated approach. The Commission sets out its concerns, and the parties, they match the concerns. They don't agree to any liability, but they try to address the concerns and they offer remedies. The remedies are then being market tested. If the Commission is happy and broadly other stakeholders are rather positive to the remedies offered, then the remedies are accepted, the case is closed, and no fine is imposed. So what we see here in terms of the type of the decision is a broad half and half between infringement and commitment decisions. What we see when it comes to the remedy type is that in all of the cases, the remedy has been behavioral. So we haven't gone beyond behavioral remedies. Here, the Google Ad Tech case is really interesting because in this case, the Commission has suggested a preference, a clear preference with respect to a structural remedy already since the SO, and the Commission has been then heavily criticized because that's not the approach they adopted in the final decision, where they said that these are the concerns. We don't see any other way where the concerns can be resolved other than structural remedy. But hey, we leave it up to Google to present the remedy and see if we're happy with that remedy. So they didn't go as far as sort of imposing themselves a structural remedy for good reasons. This is why I mentioned before that from an EU law perspective, sometimes that would not be allowed under the EU court's case law. And this is a point that John raised before, that we tend to see competition authorities trying new theories of harm, but there's so much you can do because ultimately these decisions will be challenged and will be challenged hard before the courts. And you don't want to see these cases being lost on that point. Okay, so I have touched upon some of the issues that you see on the slide. So self-preferencing, a novel theory of harm at the time, a protracted investigation spanning 7 years. It was resolved with a very high fine, and then again, no fine is high enough when we're talking such big, such companies with such a high market capitalization. And the remedy here was a cease and desist order, so stop what you're doing, which even that is hard. So we're going to see with respect to the Apple anti-steering case. Stop what you're doing. What should you put in place instead? Who is going to monitor that? Even the cease and desist sometimes is hard to enforce here. Plus, we had an equal treatment remedy, so you should treat competitive comparison shopping services equally as your own. Who is going to monitor that? And how do you ensure that Google is not affording preferential treatment to its own services? So in essence, a recurring theme here is that you have someone controlling the whole ecosystem, acting as sort of as a sort of a quasi-regulator on that. And then you have competition law intervening in a way that sometimes enforcers cannot monitor, and no one is happy. Google is not happy, competitors are not happy. So one could say, okay, what has come out of this case after now 15 years? It's still debated. The other avenue that we haven't discussed, and it's working in some countries, and I'm thinking here the UK, is private enforcement. So this is a case that is going on before UK courts from affected parties. They're claiming damages with respect to Google practices. Interestingly here, there is a DMA investigation for pretty much self-preferencing practices. So the Digital Markets Act is a sort of complementary to competition law, and it shares many commonalities with competition law enforcement. But it's more it's more hard law in its approach, in the sense that you have Article 5 and Article 6 that set out the obligations for gatekeepers. And once you are assigned a gatekeeper status with respect to your core, to each of your core platform services, then you need to abide by the DMA. We're not looking at effects. There is no efficiency defense. You need to abide. So it should be clear, right? But how do you abide with the DMA obligations that are supposed to be pretty evident in their enforcement at the end of the day? So we had the Google Shopping case on self-preferencing, and there is a similar obligation under the DMA. Google was supposed to comply with that. According to the commission, they didn't, and they brought a non-compliance case, and now we're expecting the penalty for this case. So again, 15 years more than when the case started, plus a regulation. Where does that leave us, really? And we need to think about that. So I think sort of what John is trying to do, adopting a broader lens under competition law, is very, very useful indeed. We have other, so building on that, and that was the point on speed, we have other cases that built on that theory of harm, and they were resolved much quicker. I'm thinking here the Amazon Marketplace case, which was resolved with commitments, and the remedy here arguably was more effective than the Google Shopping remedy. And then we have Google Ad Tech under this category, and we can discuss it later because I'm kind of running out of time. Tying, I'm using it as an example, as a sort of established theory of harm in the Google Android case. But again, the market has already tipped here. Should we intervene in a more proactive manner by sort of enforcing restorative remedies? My argument in the book and in the current research I'm trying to put together is that yes, we can, under EU law as well. Other cases, anti-steering, this again, pretty much like the Google self-preferencing case under the EU, we have the App Store case, fine. This is interesting because here the fine was very low, it's some 100 million, and it was inflated a lot, bringing it up to billions because of deterrence. So the way the Commission has calculated the fine in this case is really interesting, and it was coupled with a cease and desist order. But how can Apple? Apple has many ways to do that, and according to the DMA investigation on this, they didn't do it in a way that is compliant with the DMA at least, and arguably with competition law in that case as well. So we already have a non-compliance decision with respect to Apple's practices under the DMA as well. The fourth category of anti-competitive practices that we discuss in the book is the preferential use of data. And this has been discussed much of the case law under the unfair terms point of Article 102 as an exploitative abuse. And interestingly here, and that's another interesting point of EU competition law, is the interplay between EU enforcement and national enforcement. And for some difficult cases, the truth of the matter is that national competition authorities have taken the lead. And here, the German Facebook case, this is the last bullet point, Facebook Germany, has taken the lead. Where does that leave us, though? Because again, non-compliance investigation under the DMA on the very theory of harm that German competition authority was investigating. Okay, this is pretty much the picture we have in the EU, multiple instruments, some very bold and courageous attempts on the part of the Commission to intervene, coupled with the adoption of the DMA, but we're not quite there yet, unfortunately. So in China, with respect to similar practices, the first point is that they have imposed very high fines when it comes to exclusive dealing practices that have been dealt under the abuse of dominance provisions. There is case law that has targeted algorithmic abuses when it comes to predatory pricing, self-preferencing, as well as price discrimination. And interestingly here, and that's an important thing to bear in mind, apart from hardcore enforcement, cases, fines, they also supplement the high fines with a sort of proactive auditing approach. So they actively monitor market platform fairness, data usage, and pricing ethics in real time. And this is sort of, you can draw an analogy with the tool of sector inquiries under EU competition law market studies that we have in the UK. And the final point that I've touched upon briefly when it comes to the EU is the rise of private litigation in China as well. And this is something that in the EU, it hasn't picked up so much. In the UK, there's a lot of cases dealing with abuse of dominance against powerful platforms. And we have some member states, and I'm thinking here primarily the Netherlands, that we see emerging case law, but this doesn't hold true across the EU. And finally, on mergers, and very briefly, so some of the issues we're dealing with under the abuse of dominance monopolization cases, and this goes also to the FTC case that we've discussed before, is how did those players grow so exponentially? And there's a big discussion about how merger control has missed the mark under EU competition law as well. And we've heard many sort of heads of agencies discussing about statistics and the number of cases that have gone unchallenged, undetected. And there are many reasons why that is. Under EU competition law, one reason is the jurisdictional threshold. So because the target often does not generate enough turnover, we cannot even review the transaction. And there have been suggestions to sort of adopt a different jurisdictional threshold, so move from a turnover-based threshold to a transaction value threshold. In the EU, this has not been adopted. It has been adopted in quite a few member states, though. And in my view, it was not that successful. The EU Commission tried to do it differently. So they tried to get national competition authorities involved. And they said, look, if there is something that looks suspicious, just refer it to us. Now, this is Article 22 of the European Union Merger Regulation. Can the Commission do that? Now we have the answer by the Court of Justice of the European Union. The answer is no. And this goes to when no competition authority in the EU has competence to review a merger, this cannot be referred to the European Commission. And this is the Illumina Grail case. And as sort of an interesting story, was then the Hellenic Competition Commission was one of the referring authorities at the time. And we have referred the case to the Commission, and other national competition authorities have referred the case to the Commission. But we were very cognizant at the time that this has not been tried before. The General Court sided with the Commission and national competition authorities. Unfortunately, that decision was reversed before the Court of Justice. But the sort of takeaway point here is that in the EU, we have tried to cast the net wider to review those transactions. That's the first point, rather unsuccessfully, if you ask me. But also the Commission has succeeded in testing out new theories of harm. And I'm thinking here, the Booking It Travel Light case. What's the picture when it comes to merger control in China? There have been similarly efforts to sort of change and sharpen their toolbox, especially when it comes to VIEs, variable interest entity structures. So now regulators can explicitly review VIE deals and actively penalize failure to notice. And there are quite a few cases where this has been used. So similarly to some member states in the EU, we see now that there is a more proactive scrutiny of below threshold deals in China as well. The 2022 AML has upgraded merger enforcement tools when it comes to stop the clock, when it comes to more procedural mechanisms, stop the clock, heightened maximum penalties for mergers that have not been notified or have been blocked. And when it comes to substantive assessment, again, they have sharpened their guidelines to include more advanced theories when it comes to how we deal with market definition, how to assess data accumulation advantages, cross-platform network effects, ecosystem lock-in, and so on and so forth. So just to finish up on a couple of comparative thoughts, conclusions, what we see is that both jurisdictions have tried to modernize the antitrust enforcement toolbox. They have both actively targeted difficult cases, when the EU more so in the sphere of abuse of dominance. Has that been effective? Not that much, but this is a rather difficult area. They have both tried to sort of close merger control loopholes. In China, this has been more effective than in the EU because of the history with the Lumina Grail case I have just discussed. Both jurisdictions have adopted a more integrative approach, and I think when you deal with I have started with the sort of the anatomy of digital markets and moving from platform to ecosystems, the role of data, and unavoidably you should do that. We cannot sort of avoid the problem, because indeed the problems here are different than the more traditional hub-and-spoke analysis that we run in other markets. We see convergence in intent, in objectives, divergence in the method. So China has invoked a soft mechanism more often than the EU, and this may be good, this may be bad, and we can debate that from a legal certainty perspective. But the takeaway message for both jurisdictions, I think, is that it sharply points to the limit of competition law. And unfortunately, sometimes we also see the limits of regulation in this sphere. So I'm going to leave you to that, and looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great. Excellent, Maria. Thank you.